Wonders of the African World, page 198. We learn the Portuguese come to the so-called Gold Coast, and soon this area is producing one-tenth of the world's gold supply. Many people may be relieved to know that during this period, most of the African slaves that the Portuguese bought were sold to the Gold Coast. The Portuguese didn't really have anything that the people on the Gold Coast desired, but slaves were sufficient for exchange in gold. It also needs to be emphasized that during the early period, slavery in America was not based on race, but as we get closer to the 1700s, a sort of racial slavery becomes a concrete thing in the colonies. Let's hear what the PBS site on the slave trade has to say.
From 1619 on, not long after the first settlement, the need for colonial labor was bolstered by the importation of African captives. At first, like their poor English counterparts, the Africans were treated as indentured servants, who would be freed of their obligations to their owners after serving for several years. However, over the course of the century, a new race-based slavery system developed, and by the dawn of the new century, the majority of Africans and African Americans were slaves for life. The Middle Passage. 1680, the Royal African Company transports 5,000 African captives annually. By the 18th century, 45,000 Africans are transported annually on British ships.
As the last bit showed us, there was a boom amongst the English slave traders in the 18th century. Gates also tells us that there was a dramatic reversal where people on the Gold Coast ceased purchasing slaves and instead sold slaves for gold. He mentions reasons for this increasing European demand for slaves. That in 1662, the Dutch won a contract to supply slaves to Spanish America. I can only conclude that the ensuing political turmoil was a result of the slave trade rather than just something that happened to be a coincidence that the demand for European slaves went up and then there's political turmoil and that just happened to supply slaves.
For a male slave in 1704, the English were offering merchandise worth nearly 3 ounces of gold. General William de Laclama wrote in 1704, so that the Negroes seeing this, now pay more attention to the slave trade than the gold trade, as they do better by it. And Director General William Butler of Elmina complained that the gold trade had decreased in volume by 50% due to the very heavy payments, which the Negroes receive for their slaves. Page 200. By the first 2 decades of the 18th century, the Gold Coast was increasingly identified with the slave trade, while the gold trade had decreased in volume by something like 50%. 6 years later, another report indicated that the gold trade had dwindled to nothing. This transformation was accelerated by the increased demand for slaves from the New World plantations, and higher prices. To the West Africans, gold had always been more than just a medium of exchange, and they were reluctant to part with it. Also, the king of Dahomey had banned the export of gold from his kingdom, and many traders on the Gold Coast accepted only gold for slaves.
This last part is significant and completely supports my theory that European slave traders had to manipulate African money markets in order to expand and maintain the slave trade on a mammoth scale. And one has to ask, reluctant to part with their gold, why the hell would they decide they didn't like exporting gold after supplying 1/10 of the world's supply for over a century? I believe the expansion of the slave trade and the violent wars that took place all over Africa were because of the slave trade, to sell them on the overseas market, and this was done by the European slave traders who manipulated the money markets of the different places in Africa. And remember, different places use different currency. So in this place, I'm talking about the Gold Coast. So Gold Coast, the gold is the currency of choice. And other places, you will find that they start importing things like cowrie cells and all kinds of different items.
I verily believe that the far greater part of the wars, in Africa, would cease, if the Europeans would cease to tempt them, by offering goods for slaves. And though they do not bring legions into the field, their wars are bloody. I believe, the captives reserved, for sale are fewer than the slain. I have not sufficient data to warrant calculation, but, I suppose, not less than 100,000 slaves are exported, annually, from all parts of Africa, and that more than one half of these are exported in English bottoms. If but an equal number are killed in war, and if many of these wars are kindled by the incentive of selling their prisoners, what an annual accumulation of blood must there be, crying against the nations of Europe concerned in this trade, and particularly against our own.